The colony was already burning when Cale Dorn decided he was done being afraid. He could see it through the scratched porthole of the Cellar team's assault shuttle, a cylinder of pressurized rock and steel 9 kilometers long, venting atmosphere in 3 places, the gas catching the distant sun like a halo of blue fire. Inside that cylinder, somewhere among the silent corridors and the spinning debris and the 26,000 civilians who had no idea what was coming for them, was a ghost. Her name was Ren Ayara. She had been dead for 14 months. Cale pressed his forehead against the porthole glass and let the cold of it run through him. In the seat beside him, Mira Song was running combat diagnostics on her data slate with the focused blankness of someone who had found the exact frequency at which professionalism became a wall. Across the aisle, the 4 soldiers of Cellar team sharpened nothing, cleaned nothing, said nothing. Combat veterans all. The kind of quiet that had been earned. "She's in there," Mira said, not looking up. "The resonance readings are consistent with a psychoframe active at sub-threshold. She's hiding. She's always hiding." Cale pulled back from the porthole. "That's what she does now. She didn't used to. She used to be alive." Mira set the data slate on her knee. "She was beautiful in the way that people who have spent a decade building armor over something beautiful always are. The grace still there, but governed, rationed, kept on a very short leash. She was 28 years old. She had the eyes of someone 20 years older. Do you remember when we were 11, she said. In the shelter at Karatha Station? Cale remembered. He always remembered. You didn't forget the moment your life split into before and after. The Vorath had come without warning, as they always did. The first wave of their advanced scouts looked like nothing. Small dark nodes moving at the edge of long-range sensor coverage. Easy to dismiss as debris, as instrument error, as the particular loneliness that deep space listening posts bred in their human operators. Cale had been 11 years old, living in a welfare block near the station's agricultural ring, and he had felt them before anyone's instruments had confirmed them. He couldn't explain how. He still couldn't. He felt a wrongness the way you feel a tooth beginning to ache. Not pain yet, just a low-frequency certainty that pain was coming. He had told Mira and Ren, and they had believed him without question, the way children believe each other in the dark. And the 3 of them had pulled the fire alarm and screamed through 2 levels of residential block and dragged 900 people into blast shelters 40 minutes before the Vorath's first kinetic strike turned the station's upper ring to vapor. Later, the authorities called them the Miracle Children. Cale had never felt miraculous. He had felt lucky and terrified in equal measure, and in the years that followed, he learned to suspect that those 2 feelings were the same thing. The shuttle banked hard and the colony filled the view screen. Up close, it was enormous. Cylinder 7 of the Corinthus cluster, built to house a mixed human population 2 generations ago. Its hull plated in the pale gray ceramic that the Vorath couldn't seem to make resonance readings through. That was why the refugees had gone there. That was why the Vorath had followed anyway. Approaching launch bay, the pilot said. Narrative is prepped. Cale stood. He was 25 years old, and his military file said he was unremarkable, which was technically true in every way that the military could measure. He had an average kill count for his service grade. He filed his reports on time. He kept his combat suit clean and his opinions private. He had not, in 4 years of service, done anything that would cause his superiors to look at him twice. He had also not, in 4 years of service, done anything without thinking about Ren first. Whether she would approve. Whether she would have seen this angle, this outcome, this trap before it closed. Ren had been the one of the 3 of them who was actually different. Not in the vague, socially constructed way that the Vorath specialists had later classified all 3 of them, but in the deep biological way, the way a tuning fork is different from a rock. She had seen the future in her bones, and then they had let the wrong people know. The RX-9 narrative Gundam was waiting in the launch bay with all the patience of a machine, which was the only kind of patience it was capable of. Cale pulled himself along the guide rail and settled into the cockpit, and the familiar smell of it hit him. Recycled air and synthetic lubricant, and the faint electrical smell that combat suits always carried, the smell of power waiting. "Combat check," said Lieutenant Commander Iago Hakana over the tactical channel. He was a large man with a veteran's measured voice, the kind of voice that had stopped shaking so long ago that the stillness had become part of his personality. Cellar team, sound off. They sounded off. Cale ran through his own systems. The narrative was not the most powerful machine in the human arsenal. It was a prototype, a platform intended to be modified and adapted, a frame without a fixed identity. It could be configured for long-range fire support, or close-quarters boarding, or electronic warfare, depending on the mission loadout. In this moment, it was configured for capture and contain, which was a polite way of saying that Kyle was supposed to use the minimum force necessary to bring something home that might not want to come. The Phoenix-class unit designated Ghost 1 is believed to be sheltering in the colony's agricultural ring, Hakana continued. Civilian evacuation is 63% complete. Our objective is to locate and retrieve the unit before the Vorath Reclaimer fleet arrives. ETA on Reclaimer is 40 minutes. And if it won't come, asked Cellar 2, then we bring the pilot. The unit follows the pilot. That's the theory. Kale said nothing. He knew that was the theory. He had been the one to tell them the theory during the debrief 16 months ago when Mira had sat across a table from Federation intelligence officers and explained very calmly that the three of them had been friends since childhood and that Ren would respond to Kale's presence in ways she would not respond to firepower. He had watched Mira say this and understood, in the way you understand betrayal before you can name it, that she was not wrong. He launched. The colony interior was everything Nightmare was made of. A gravitational cylinder spinning at 1/3 standard, the sun strip along its central axis flickering where the power grid had taken damage, and the agricultural ring rendered into a maze of toppled hydroponic towers and ruptured irrigation lines, water drifting in great globes through the reduced gravity zones near the axis. The narrative moved through it carefully. Kale breathed carefully. He had learned to match his breathing to his movement in tight spaces, an old instinct from the shelter at Karatha Station, where 900 people had breathed the same limited air for 6 hours and learned to ration themselves. He felt her before he saw her. Not a visual contact, not a sensor contact, something older. The particular quality of silence that Ren had always carried around her, even as a child. She had been quiet the way deep water is quiet, pressure and stillness both at once. He had grown up measuring the texture of that silence. He knew its weight. Ghost 1 bearing 275, he said quietly over the TAC channel. Hakana's voice came back after a beat. Confirmed. How are you reading that? Sensors show nothing. I know. He moved toward 275. She was floating in the center of an emptied greenhouse dome. The Phoenix-class unit in full golden shimmer. The emergency lighting of the dome painting her in amber and shadow. The unit was, there was no other word for it, beautiful. In the way that things which have transcended their original purpose become beautiful. It had been a weapon. Now it was something else. It hovered without thrust, holding station through some principle that KL's instruments declined to explain, and its sensor arrays were oriented toward him, with the attentiveness of something that was very much awake. "Ren," he said over the open channel. The unit did not respond, but neither did it flee. "I know you can hear me. I know you're in there. I'm not here to bring you back against your will. I need you to know that." The words cost him something. He had rehearsed them 6 times, and they still cost him something when they were real. "I also need you to know that the Vorath Reclaimer fleet is 38 minutes out. There are 9,000 civilians still on this station. If you leave now, they're going to die. If you stay and fight, you might die. I know that's not." He stopped, started again. "I know you've already died once. I know I don't have the right to ask." The golden unit shifted, just slightly. A micro-rotation, orienting its head toward him at an angle that was almost human. The way you tilt your head when someone says something unexpected. Then the Vorath came early. The breach happened at the colony's polar cap. A clean cut through 4 meters of reinforced ceramic that the Vorath's hull-piercing lances made look effortless. Kale felt the pressure change before his instruments caught it, a wave of something wrong rolling through the hull of the dome, and then the tactical channel erupted. Multiple contacts, North Polar approach, Reclaimer elements, 2 confirmed harvesters. Civilian Block 7 is not clear. Repeat, 7 is not. A Harvester-class Vorath combat unit was approximately the size of a Federation heavy cruiser and roughly as interested in negotiation. They had been designed, if designed was the word for something that had grown, over 600 years of continuous warfare against a succession of species that the Vorath had progressively located, assessed, and absorbed. They were not cruel in any way that mapped to human cruelty. They simply processed. That was worse. The first harvester came through the polar breach trailing vacuum in its own bioluminescent wake, and it was enormous, a cathedral of alien chitin and pulsing organ light. its manipulation limbs folded against its thorax in the compact posture that preceded engagement. The colony's structural integrity alarm began its flat, patient wail. Shazar team hit it from 3 angles simultaneously. Kale watched their ordnance detonate against the harvester's chitinous plating and leave marks that were functionally decorative. The Voreth did not have armor in the human sense of the word. They had history, layers of calcified tissue that represented 6 centuries of adapting to being shot at. "We're not doing anything," Shazar 2 said, and there was no panic in her voice. Just the honest assessment of a professional encountering a gap between capability and requirement. "Iago, we are not doing anything to this contact. Fall back to the civilian corridors. Delay and screen." Kale was already moving. Not falling back, moving parallel, looking for an angle that the harvester's layered sensor suite wouldn't cover. The narrative was not built for this. It was built for capture and contain, and right now the thing it was supposed to be containing was floating in an amber dome while 9,000 people ran. He looked back at the Phoenix. It was still there, still watching. "I know you can stop it," he said. He wasn't sure if the channel was open. He opened it to make sure. "Ren, I know you can stop it. I've seen the after-action recordings from the Laplace engagement. I know what you can do. I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to do it for the people in Block 7 who still don't have a ship. Nothing. I'm asking you to do it because you always knew what mattered, and you always had to fight everyone around you to do anything about it. I'm asking you because you were right about Karatha, and right about the Grips research station, and right about everything, and we didn't listen. And
I'm sorry."
I am sorry, Ren. I have been sorry for 11 years. The second harvester came through the breach. Kale hit his maneuvering thrusters and drove the narrative toward the first one, emptying his railgun magazine into the joint between its thorax and its first manipulation limb. The rounds went in and something wet came out, and the harvester oriented toward him with what might, on a human face, have been annoyance. He had its attention. He had bought approximately nothing with that attention except the experience of having all of it. The manipulation limb came for him, and he rolled the narrative hard, and the claw caught his left shoulder assembly and tore it partially away, and the cockpit filled with damage alarms and the particular grinding sensation of structural compromise, and Kale thought, with the strange clarity that fear sometimes produced, "This is it. This is the end of the sentence." The limb didn't complete its grip. The Phoenix hit the harvester from the right side with a force that the laws of physics were clearly embarrassed about. Not a weapon strike. Not a beam or a missile or any mechanism that Kale's instruments could parse. The golden unit simply arrived at the harvester at very high speed, and the harvester went a different direction, and the dome around them shuddered with the propagation of whatever had just happened. The harvester recovered. It was very good at recovering, but the Phoenix was between it and the civilian corridor now, and it was glowing, the deep ember gold of its hull brightening towards something beyond color, toward a frequency that Kale's visual processing had trouble categorizing. The second harvester changed course, oriented toward the Phoenix. "No," Kale said, and fired his maneuvering thrusters without a coherent plan. The narrative put itself between the second harvester and the Phoenix, and Kale looked at his weapons inventory and found one partial railgun magazine and a sidearm mounted on the left hip assembly that he had never, in 4 years of service, actually fired in combat, because situations requiring a sidearm from inside a combat frame were situations that had already gone catastrophically wrong. He fired the sidearm. The rounds bounced off the second harvester's plating, and the harvester looked at the narrative the way something very large looks at something very small that has done something very stupid. Kale laughed. He was not entirely sure why. It came out of him without permission, a real laugh. The kind he hadn't produced in a long time. Not amusement exactly, but something closer to the pure absurdity of standing between two entities that could both destroy him without breaking rhythm and deciding to stand there anyway. He had spent 4 years trying not to feel things. He was feeling all of them now. "I know this doesn't work," he said aloud, to himself, to Ren, to no one. "I know I can't stop this. I know I'm just a guy in a broken frame with one gun, but I'm not moving, so..."
He exhaled. "So do something about it."
The Phoenix's light changed. Afterward, KL would spend considerable time attempting to describe what happened next, and finding that language was not adequately tooled for the task. The closest he could manage was this. The Phoenix unit projected itself outward. Not physically, it remained stationary. But something in it, some property of the psychoframe material that composed its hull, broadcast at a frequency that human science had partially classified and mostly declined to fully examine because the implications were uncomfortable. It broadcast the consciousness of the person whose pattern it contained. It broadcast Ren, not her voice, not a recording. Ren, her actual cognitive signature, the electrochemical shape of a mind that had spent its whole life processing the world at a resolution no human instrument could match. Cale felt her the way he had felt her in the shelter at Karatha, that specific silence, that particular pressure, and tears came to his eyes before he could do anything about them. The Vorath harvesters stopped. This was noteworthy. The Vorath did not stop. In 600 years of documented engagements, the Vorath had not stopped for anything. Not for weapon fire, not for surrender signals, not for the detonation of colony reactors, or the desperate ramming of civilian ships. They processed, they continued. Stopping was not in their operational vocabulary, except they had stopped. They were oriented toward the Phoenix, and they were completely still, and Cale's instruments were recording something he had never seen before. A response pattern from the Vorath communication nodes that the xenolinguistics team later classified, after considerable argument, as query. The Vorath were asking a question. They were asking, in whatever analog existed, for question within a distributed alien cognition, what they were experiencing. They had never encountered a human mind like this before. The Vorath had processed humans for 600 years, and they knew humans as biological units with variable cognitive capacity and a baffling tendency to self-destruct rather than submit to processing. They had modeled human minds extensively. But a human mind that broadcast at this frequency, with this resolution, with this kind of reach, this was something outside their model, something that didn't fit. Ren spoke to them. Cale couldn't hear what she said. He felt the shape of it. Something immense and sad and very, very old. The way she had always felt when she was trying to explain something to someone who didn't have the equipment to understand it. She had felt that way explaining things to Mira and Cale often enough when they were children, and she had never once been unkind about the gap. That was the thing about Ren. She had always been kind about the gap. The harvesters retreated, not fled. Retreated, a controlled withdrawal, the kind that implied a decision had been made. They went back through the polar breach, and the breach sealed behind them. Or rather, the breach stopped mattering. The pressure differential equalizing in a way that the colony's engineers later found difficult to explain, because the structural damage was still there, but the atmospheric loss had simply ceased. Cale stared at his sensors. Shazar team stared at their sensors. Hakana was quiet for a long time. What? Said Shazar 2. Just happened. She talked to them, Cale said. She. A pause. She talked to the Vorath. Yes, and they left. Yes. Another long pause. What did she say? Cale thought about Ren at 11 years old, pulling fire alarms in a residential block at 3 in the morning, screaming herself hoarse, dragging people who didn't know her toward safety. He thought about Ren at 16 in the Grips research facility, running neural interface tests that left her with nosebleeds that lasted hours, never complaining, always asking the researchers to explain what they'd found. He thought about Ren at 17 when they'd taken her for the next phase of testing, and the door had closed, and he hadn't gone after her. He had stood in the corridor and let Mira pull him away, and he had not gone after her. That was the sentence he had been serving for 8 years. That was the debt. I don't know exactly, he said, but I think she told them what we are, what humans actually are, not what they'd modeled. Which is what? Cale looked at the Phoenix, floating in the dome, the amber light of emergency power washing it in something that looked almost like warmth. Grief, he said. She told them about grief, about what it does to us, about how we carry the dead with us and let them change the way we move. The Vorath have been processing species for 6 centuries. They've never encountered a species that keeps going back for who they lost. He paused. We're not optimized. We're haunted. And we made something out of that haunting that a machine mind that processes and discards can't model. It doesn't fit their framework. It looks from the outside like a kind of irrational behavior, Hakana said. A kind of infinity, Cale said. He turned the narrative toward the Phoenix. The golden unit was dimming now, the broadcast fading, the light returning to something in the visible spectrum. He moved close, slowly, deliberately, the way you approach something that might still be afraid. Ren, he said softly, you can come home. The Phoenix's sensor array oriented toward him, that almost human tilt of attention. I know that's complicated. I know home doesn't mean what it used to. I know what they put you through, and I know what I didn't do, and I know you don't owe me anything. Not one thing. His voice wasn't entirely steady. He had stopped apologizing for that several minutes ago. But the people in this colony are going to need someone to explain to them what happened. And I don't know how to explain it without you. The Phoenix moved. Slowly, without the physics-defying speed of its combat intervention, it floated toward the narrative. Close enough that if both units had been human-sized, they could have touched. Mura's voice came over the channel. Kale, I know, the cockpit is empty. The unit, the psycho frame, absorbed her pattern when she died. There's no one to come home. I know that too. He reached out the narrative's remaining functional arm. The gesture was purely symbolic, a machine extending a hand to another machine in a gesture that only made sense in human terms. It made no sense in any other terms. That was exactly why he made it. The Phoenix pressed its own hand forward and touched the narrative's extended palm. For a moment that his instruments recorded as 1.3 seconds and that he experienced as much longer, Kale felt Ren with perfect clarity. Not a memory, not a hallucination. The actual texture of her attention, curious, steady, warm, in the way that very precise people are warm when they're being careful with someone they love. He felt her say something he couldn't hear and understood it anyway. It's okay, Kale. You came back for me. That counts. Then the Phoenix released his hand and turned toward the breach, and the emergency lighting caught it, and it blazed gold one final time, and it was gone. Not through the breach, but simply gone, accelerating past any sensor range he had in a span of time too short to record, leaving the dome empty and amber and very, very quiet. Kale held the narrative's arm in the position it had been holding for a long time after. No particular reason. He just wasn't ready to put it down yet. Cellar lead, this is Damascus, the ship's communications officer said over the channel. We're reading the Vorith reclaimer fleet at full withdrawal. All elements, repeat, all elements. A pause that contained considerable emotion being professionally managed. What happened down there? Hakana looked at Kale's feed. Ensign Dorn, your report. Kale thought about it. He thought about a shelter at Karatha Station and 3 children who felt what no one else had felt in time to matter. He thought about the particular silence of deep water and the way grief, if you carry it long enough and carefully enough, can become something that burns. We had help, he said. He stayed like that until Mira's voice came over the channel again, quieter this time. Kale, civilians are clear, all of them. He heard it. He let it land. 26,000 people. He thought about the shelter at Karatha. 900 people who had believed 3 screaming children at 3 in the morning because there was nothing else to believe. He thought about how fear and luck were the same feeling, and how sometimes the math worked out, and sometimes it didn't. And the difference between the 2 outcomes was a girl who could feel the shape of the future, and a boy who finally, 11 years too late, had gone after her. Copy, he said, coming in. He turned the narrative toward the launch bay. The left shoulder assembly dragged behind it at an angle that the structural integrity display described as critical. He flew it carefully, the way you carry something broken that you are not ready to put down. In the weeks that followed, the xenolinguistics team studied the recordings from the colony dome and argued extensively about what the Phoenix had actually broadcast and what the Vorith had actually received. There were 4 competing theoretical frameworks and 3 separate interdepartmental disputes, and 1 researcher who submitted a paper arguing that the event had not happened in any way that existing physics could accommodate, and then resigned from the department before the paper cleared peer review. The Vorith reclaimer fleet did not return to the Corinthus cluster. Not that week, not in the months that followed. Surveyor drones recorded Vorith activity at the edge of human-inhabited space, watching, probing at sensor distances, but not advancing. Something had changed in their model. Something they had experienced required, apparently, a period of processing before they were willing to engage again with a species that had shown them a quality they had not accounted for. The civilian population of Cylinder 7 completed its evacuation, all 26,000 people. 0 casualties from the Vorith incursion. 41 injuries from the structural damage during the initial breach, none fatal. The engineers who patched the polar cap did not find a good explanation for why the atmospheric loss had stopped, and eventually wrote unknown compensating factor in the report and moved on. KL filed his after-action report. He used the word unknown 5 times in 5 different contexts, and each time it was accurate. He ate in the ship's mess, with Shazar team, who had not stopped looking at him with a particular expression. Not quite awe, not quite discomfort. Somewhere in the intersection of both that soldiers sometimes occupy when they've been near something that exceeded the category of war and hadn't found new words for it yet. Mira found him on the observation deck the night the Damascus entered transit back to Farpoint Station. She sat beside him without ceremony, and they watched the stars move for a while, and he didn't say anything, and neither did she, and that was the most comfortable either of them had been in 8 years. "You knew she could do it," Mira said, finally. "I hoped." "That's not what I said." He looked at his hands. "I felt her in the dome, before any sensor contact. The same way I felt the approach vectors at Karatha. She was right there, present." He paused. "She wasn't angry. Were you expecting her to be?" "I was expecting anything. I was prepared for anything." Mira was quiet for a moment. "I think about the facility, Grips. What they did to her. I know. I think about it every day. I know that too. I made the decision," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I made the decision, and I told you it was the only option, and I was wrong. I was 17, and I was wrong, and I have thought about it every day for 8 years. Mira, I am not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to know that I know." She looked at her hands. "And to know that I'm glad it was you who went after her. I'm glad she had you there." Cale was quiet for a while. "She felt like herself," he said finally. "Whatever she is now, whatever the Phoenix does with whatever's left of her, she felt exactly like herself, still curious, still steady." He exhaled. "Still kinder than we deserved." The stars moved outside the observation deck. Mira leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes, and the tension in her went. Not all of it, but some portion of it that had been load-bearing for a long time. Cale watched her and felt with some surprise that the weight in his own chest had shifted. Not lifted, not gone, but distributed differently. Spread across a wider surface, easier to carry. "She said something," he said. "I couldn't hear it, but I understood it." "What was it?" "She said it counted. That I came back for her. That it counted." Mira opened her eyes and looked at the stars and didn't say anything for a long time. "Good," she said finally, very quietly. "Good." 3 months after the event designated the Corinthus incident in Federation records, a xenolinguistic specialist named Dr. Yeva Okafor published a paper arguing that what the Phoenix had broadcast during the 4.7-minute engagement was not a communication in any conventional sense, but something that might best be described as a demonstration, an experiential sample, a showing. What the Vorith had received, she argued, was a direct cognitive experience of human loss. Not the concept of loss, not a description of it, but the actual weight and texture of it as experienced by a specific human mind. A mind that had spent its entire consciousness being processed, studied, isolated, experimented upon, and had never once, through any of it, stopped caring about the 2 children it had grown up with in a welfare block at Karatha Station. The paper was peer-reviewed by 12 specialists and accepted by 11 of them. The 12th specialist submitted a dissent, arguing that the methodology was sound, but the conclusions were too conservative. What the Vorith had received, this specialist argued, was not just a demonstration of grief. It was a demonstration of what grief produces, of what happens to a species that refuses to leave its dead behind, that carries them forward, that builds things out of that carrying, that turns loss into a kind of fuel that outlasts the original loss itself. The Vorith had been processing species for 6 centuries. They had built their operational model on the assumption that consciousness, stripped of its biological substrate and absorbed into the Vorith collective, became simply part of the collective. Useful, accessible, gone. They had absorbed human consciousness before. They had found it unexceptional. But they had never encountered a human consciousness that had already been stripped of its biological substrate and had refused to become simply part of something else, that had maintained its own coherence, that had, somehow, preserved the specific texture of a specific person, her curiosity, her steadiness, her particular quality of attention, in a matrix of exotic materials whose theoretical properties human science was still arguing about. They had never encountered a ghost that was still unmistakably itself. The dissenting specialist concluded that the Vorith reclaimer fleet had not withdrawn because it was afraid of human grief. It had withdrawn because it had encountered something that didn't fit into its model of what consciousness was. And the Vorith, despite 6 centuries of confident processing, had enough integrity to pause when confronted with a genuine anomaly. The anomaly was this: humans, apparently, sometimes haunted things back. The paper was classified at the Federation Council level within 72 hours of publication. Dr. Okafor was reassigned to a theoretical research posting on Luna that was comfortable and very far from any xenolinguistics conference. The 11 peer reviewers were quietly asked to sign confidentiality agreements. The 12th specialist, the one who had submitted the dissent, had already anticipated this and submitted the full paper to 4 separate civilian academic archives before classification could be applied, and by the time the Federation's information management teams found them all, a version had reached the colony networks, then the trade routes, then the independent stations, then everywhere. People talked about it in the way people talk about things they don't fully understand but recognize as important. Soldiers shared it on closed channels. Station workers argued about it in break rooms. Xeno researchers who had spent careers trying to build a framework for Vorath cognition stayed up late and read it 3 times. The part they kept coming back to was the simplest part, a mind that had been stripped of its body and should, by every established principle of consciousness transfer, have dissipated, had not dissipated, had held together, had maintained not just cognitive function but specific character, specific personality, specific warmth toward 2 specific people who had, in various ways and for various reasons, failed her. Nobody had a good theory for why. The best guess, published anonymously on a colony network 6 weeks after the Corinthus incident and never formally attributed, but widely suspected to have originated from someone with direct access to the Psychoframe research archives, was that the material had not simply recorded her. It had responded to her. The Psychoframe was reactive. It changed based on the consciousness it interfaced with. And Renayara's consciousness, shaped by years of carrying more than any human nervous system was meant to carry and never setting any of it down, had apparently impressed itself into the exotic lattice of the Phoenix's hull at a level so deep that the material had simply become, in some quantum sense, that the paper declined to fully elaborate, her. Not a recording, not an echo, a continuation. The anonymous paper ended with 1 paragraph that Kale read 4 times. The Vorath process consciousness because they believe consciousness is a resource, something to be extracted, cataloged, and incorporated. They have built their civilization on this premise for 6 centuries. What they encountered at Corinthus was a consciousness that had already been incorporated in the human sense of that word, made into a body. Given new flesh, not absorbed into something larger, but preserved as something specific. The Vorath's model has no category for this. Their withdrawal is not retreat. It is, in the most fundamental sense, revision. They are updating their understanding of what they are dealing with. We would do well to think carefully about what that means. KL had thought carefully about it. He had thought about it most nights since the Corinthus incident. In the narrow bunk on the Damascus before his transfer to Farpoint, and then in his quarters at the station, and sometimes in the middle of the day when a resettlement query crossed his desk that involved Cylinder 7 and he stopped for a moment and felt the weight of 26,000 ordinary lives that were still being lived. Kale was discharged from active duty with honors he hadn't asked for, which was standard for anyone involved in the Corinthus incident. He took a posting at Farpoint Station's Civilian Advisory Division, which was not glamorous and did not involve a combat frame. And he spent his days explaining to people what limited information was available about the Vorath's behavioral changes and why the current assessment was cautious optimism, and what that meant in practical terms for trade routes and colony planning. He was, by every measurable metric, remarkably ordinary at this job. On the 1-year anniversary of the Corinthus incident, he was sitting at his desk going through a backlog of resettlement queries when his sensor suite, a civilian model, nothing sophisticated, just the standard personal proximity unit that everyone at the station wore, registered a brief anomaly, a resonance reading in a frequency that civilian sensors weren't really designed to detect, lasting approximately 1.3 seconds. He looked up. The office was empty, nothing unusual. The lights were the same. The air was the same. The stack of resettlement queries was still precisely as uninteresting as it had been a moment ago, but the room felt for 1.3 seconds like deep water, like pressure and stillness, like a very specific quality of silence that he had grown up measuring. He held still for a long time after it passed. Then he picked up his stylus and went back to work. There were 26,000 people from Cylinder 7 who needed somewhere to go, and the processing was slow, and he was not going to finish today, but he was going to make progress. He was going to make progress because that was what you did. You kept going. You carried what you were carrying. You made it count. You made it matter. You chose every day to let the weight of what you carried change the direction you moved rather than stop you moving entirely. That was not a grand thing. It was not the stuff of Federation commendations or xenolinguistics papers or classified briefings. It was just the stubborn, ordinary arithmetic of being human, the refusal, baked somewhere below rational decision-making, to simply stop. The Vorath had processed thousands of species. They had never found one that turned grief into fuel on purpose. They were going to need more time to figure out what to do with that. It was the most human thing there was. The resettlement queries waited. Cale worked through them, one by one, in the quiet station. In the light of stars, he now understood a little better. Outside, at the edge of sensor range, Vorath drones traced the boundary of human space with a patience that was almost meditative, watching a species they were in the process of revising their model of. Somewhere beyond any sensor range, something golden moved through the dark between stars, with the ease of something that had stopped being bound by ordinary physics and had not yet decided where it was going. It moved without urgency. It had apparently a great deal of time, and it was, unmistakably, still itself.